Great Responsibility, Chapter 32, Shifting. Piper thanked the kind old Lebanese man who drove the Uber, promising him a fantastic review for getting her to the address so fast, before she grabbed her bag and left the car. He pulled away as she stared at her aunt and uncle's house. Mrs. Watson, MJ's mom, was in her garden next door, weeding the roses. She looked up and smiled brightly. "Piper, is that you? I haven't seen you around here in years." Piper swiped at her eyes and nodded, forcing a smile. "Hi, Mrs. Watson. I thought it was time to go through some of my uncle's things." Mrs. Watson glanced down at her watch. "Aren't you at school for another hour, sweetie?" Piper shook her head. "Got called out for the day." She thought for a moment. She hadn't asked Pepper for a key to her aunt and uncle's house, having only planned on ripping open one old wound for the day, but here she was. She knew Mrs. Watson was a touch nosy, so she leaned on the fence and asked a question. "Has anyone been by to change the locks?" Mrs. Watson shook her head. "No one's been by in the last 4 years, sweetheart, save the movers for the estate sale." Piper nodded and smiled before walking purposefully up to the front porch. "Thanks, Mrs. Watson." It took a few minutes of digging in the slightly overgrown roses that were beginning to climb the porch, but eventually she found the false rock that hid a slightly rusty old key. With some difficulty, she slipped the key into the lock and opened the door, closing it behind her. She sighed, looking around. The memories, happy and not so happy, were much fresher here. The last time she'd been here, she was by herself too, until the police knocked on the door from Mrs. Watson's house and told her that her uncle had been killed. She shook herself out of her old memories and looked around. It was much like she remembered it being, except the furniture was in all the wrong places, stacked near the walls. In the center of the living room was a large pile of boxes, everything her aunt and uncle had ever owned, stacked taller than she was. Her stomach grumbled. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. This looked like it was going to be a long job. She set her backpack against the door and pulled out her phone, looking up the nearest pizza place. She placed an order for delivery as she circled the large stack of boxes, trying to figure out where to start. She thanked the man on the phone and hung up, sighing. She easily pulled one of the boxes off the top. Of course, none of them were labeled. It was going to be tantamount to finding a needle buried in a graveyard looking for one tiny flash drive in everything her aunt and uncle had ever owned. She sighed. This was an exercise in pain already. 2 hours later, found Piper sitting on a mattress she'd purloined from the upstairs guest bedroom. It had been sitting against the wall. She'd had to take a few minutes when she found a photo album of much happier times. It was now safely tucked in her backpack, out of sight, out of mind, for the moment anyway. Things were scattered around her aunt's old cookbook, a box with her uncle's bowling trophies, papers, old-school projects of hers, bits and bobs from a life she hadn't had the courage to revisit in a long time. But she was only halfway through the boxes, and still no sign of the flash drive. If the drawer of guns and knives was real, and the secret room was real, there was no way the flash drive had been her imagination. She sighed in frustration, setting aside the box of linens. She pulled the next box forward and popped it open. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it as she shifted through the papers in the box. Nothing interesting. More of the same, really. She rolled her eyes and grabbed a piece of now-cold pizza out of the box that sat behind her. She set the box aside and pulled the next one out of the pile as she took a bite. Piper flopped back on the mattress, narrowly missing the now mostly empty pizza box. She checked her watch. It was nearly 7 in the evening. She'd been at this for nearly 5 hours. She sighed deeply and struggled to her feet. Her legs were stiff from sitting for so long. There were only 3 boxes left. She popped one of them open and sighed. Pots and pans. The next one had more linens. The last one held an ancient computer. Well, to her standards, anyway. She grinned and pulled it out. There was a monitor and a tower for it. A slightly cracked keyboard lay at the bottom of the box next to a wired mouse. A far cry from the tech at Stark Tower, but it was what she was looking for. Sort of. If the flash drive was going to be anywhere, it should have been there. But it wasn't. Piper swore and threw the mouse hard. It stuck in the drywall next to the door to the basement. The door creaked open, and Piper could have sworn she heard an echo. She stood from the remnants of the box and made her way over to the door. She didn't remember being in the basement a lot as a kid. It had been a laundry room and her uncle's workroom. She carefully made her way down the dusty stairs. There was nothing down here except an old disconnected washer and dryer. Piper sighed and kicked the dryer. It skidded across the floor and hit the wall. There was a thunk, and a section of brick fell free, sending up a cloud of dust that had Piper hacking and coughing, covering her mouth and nose with her shirt collar. When the dust settled, she made her way to the now open section of wall. A safe was hidden behind it. Piper stared. She had no memory of this, either her uncle or aunt ever mentioning it. She knelt down. It was the standard sort of safe you could get at any Walmart, except it was old. Older even than the 4 years it had taken Piper to come down back into the house. There was a knob on the front, clearly waiting for a code she didn't know. She looked around and whispered to herself, "Sorry, Uncle Ben." She punched the safe, the metal crumpling under her strength, and ripped the door off of it. She tossed it aside and turned on her phone's flashlight to be able to see into the dark alcove and interior of the safe. She ignored the text she had from Ava and Sam. Inside the safe was a small, neat pile of bills, emergency money probably, and a box. Piper pulled the box out of the safe and popped it open. The first thing that caught her eye was a ring box. She opened it and found her Aunt May's wedding ring. She carefully added it to the chain with her mother and father's. She'd have to find Uncle Ben's and add it, too. There were some important papers in the box, but it seemed like the rest of it was empty. Piper swore again and made to throw the now empty box, but as she moved it, she heard something shift inside. She frowned and shook the box. There was definitely something moving in it. She took a closer look at the bottom of the box, and after some searching, found a tiny catch on the inside of it. She paused. What could possibly need this much protection and secrecy to be locked in a safe, hidden behind a false wall, and put in under a false bottom of a box? Did she really want to know? She jumped as her phone began to ring. She checked the caller ID this time. She sighed and considered letting it go to voicemail, but answered after another couple of rings. "Sam, I'm kinda in the middle of something." There was a sigh of relief. "Good, you're not dead." Piper sat up, the box still in her hand. "No, I'm not dead. I told Fury I wasn't going to be available today. Lay off bugging me about training, Buckethead." Sam sighed, exasperated this time. "No, that's not it. Have you seen the news in the past few hours?" Piper shook her head as she grabbed the cash out of the safe. It didn't feel right to just leave it there. She still had the box in her hand as she began to make her way up the stairs. "No? What did I miss? Is everyone okay?" Sam spoke to someone for a minute, then his voice became clear again. "Ava's texting you the video. You need to see this." Piper backed out of the call as her phone buzzed again. She loaded the video. She watched as a distinctly male figure swooped in, saving several people from an apartment fire. Then a video cut to him stopping an armored car. Piper paused the video as he turned to web swing away. The suit was black and white. It was a black and white recreation of her own, but the figure wearing it was distinctly male. She stared for a minute. "Piper, are you still there?" Piper's grip on the box in her hand tightened. "Yeah, I'm here." "Since when is there a Spider-Man?" Piper shook her head. "I have no idea." Chapter 33, The Trip. Piper frowned at her computer, one earbud in her ear as she watched the video someone had uploaded to YouTube of the mysterious Spider-Man. The suit bothered her. It was pitch black and reminded her of the symbiote. But that shouldn't have been possible. She'd fried it. The teacher, Miss Quinn, cleared her throat. "Are you still with us, Miss Parker?" Piper paused the video and looked up. "Yes, Miss Quinn." The teacher rolled her eyes. "Then would you kindly explain the point of the field trip this afternoon?" Piper sighed. "We're going to Stark Tower to see the arc reactor and tour the research and development levels." Piper was not excited for this trip. Her dad had set it up. The school knew whose kid she was. They had to, and they would on occasion milk the crap out of it for educational purposes. Admittedly, this was the first time Piper was on one of these field trips, but she was not looking forward to it. Miss Quinn nodded and continued in her explanation. Piper put her headphone back in and turned the video back on. Pausing it again as Spider-Man began to swing away, she zoomed in on his wrist. He didn't appear to have any kind of web shooter. Instead, the web seemed to be coming directly from his wrist. Harry leaned over and grinned slightly at the video.
Having fun, Piper?
Piper rolled her eyes at him. I can't help but be curious, Harry. He looks different than Spider-Girl. Harry grinned, then frowned.
You sure you're okay, Piper? You've been off since yesterday.
Piper sighed. Yesterday, she'd gone to both of her childhood homes and found that she hadn't really known much about her parents at all. Sam's call had interrupted her before she could open the box, and she'd headed home from there. The mysterious box that had been hidden in a safe behind a false wall was now hidden under Piper's bed. She hadn't had the courage to open it last night. She wasn't sure what might be on the flash drive. She was nearly 100% positive was in the box. For it to need to be hidden away so thoroughly, she wasn't sure she really wanted to know. Just dealing with some things, I'll be fine. Harry squeezed her shoulder and leaned back into his seat. Piper glanced at him. Something seemed off. It was almost like his eyes were darker than normal. Piper shook her head. Maybe it was just her imagination. Far too soon for her tastes, they were loading onto the bus to head to Stark Tower. She snagged the seat next to Sam, missing his smirk at Harry, who was sitting behind them with Ava. Ava leaned forward and grinned.
I'm so excited. You know we're the only school he actually lets into the research and development levels?
Piper raised an eyebrow and grinned slightly.
Yeah, Ava, I wonder why that is.
Ava blushed darkly and laughed.
Oh yeah, I forgot.
Piper laughed. Harry glanced at her.
You told them?
Piper nodded. Yeah, I did. Harry frowned, but said no more, instead looking out the window. MJ turned in her seat to glance at them and shook her head. Piper was honestly kind of clueless for the smartest person she knew. The bus pulled up in front of Stark Tower and they disembarked. Pepper was waiting for them in the lobby with one of the receptionists, Trisha.
Welcome to students of Midtown High. To your left, you'll find a table with badges on it. Please find your name and pin the badge to the front of your shirt. Your badge must be visible at all times. If your badge is lost, you will be escorted out of the tour. There are no exceptions.
Pepper said, her eyes lingering on Piper for a moment as the students milled about the table, grabbing their badges.
Please stay with the tour group at all times. We'll be heading to the elevators in a moment.
Piper was expecting this to go much, much worse than it had so far. She pinned the badge to her shirt and turned, freezing, as she spotted someone coming out of the elevator. Someone who shouldn't be out of bed yet. She swore and ducked behind Harry as Tony Stark himself sauntered over to the tour group. He never led tour groups, but Piper had a sinking feeling she knew why he was here.
Pepper, is this the group of bright young high schoolers we're showing around today?
Pepper nodded, barely hiding a smile. Piper glared between them from behind Harry. He and MJ were trying not to snicker and failing miserably. And Pepper was apparently in on this. The whole world seemed against her these days.
Great. Would you mind making sure Clint and Natasha don't kill each other for me, sweetie?
He pecked Pepper on the cheek and took the tablet from her hands. Piper rolled her eyes, but she grinned. It wasn't so rare these days to see Tony being openly affectionate with his girlfriend / co-CEO. But it still made Piper grin every time. She was good for him. Several flashes from phone cameras went off as Tony smiled brightly.
All right, kiddies, welcome to Stark Tower. Most of you probably know it better as Avengers Tower, but it's still my name on the lease. So for today, we'll call it Stark Tower.
That got a few laughs and a few more camera flashes. The tour wasn't half bad, in all honesty. At least until they reached the research and development floors. They were about halfway through that section of the tour when the whole building shook violently. Piper just managed to keep her feet as dust rained from the ceiling, and the alarm started blaring. Jarvis piped up as the building shook again. Mr. Stark, the tower is coming under attack by a small group of AIM scientists. The other Avengers are already moving. Evacuate the building, Jarvis. Access the armory. The floor split open around Tony as the armory, built throughout the tower, reached out and covered him in armor. that had already saved so many. Piper began to help Miss Quinn escort the other students to the stairs. There was no way she could slip out, even in the confusion, not with her dad here. She counted heads and frowned. They were missing someone. She looked around and realized who it was. The building shook again as Piper called out. Her spidey sense went crazy as she stumbled backwards, when the building gave another mighty shake. Her eyes met Sam's as the floor gave out and she screamed as she fell.